So international politics can be complicated, every bit as much, or even more so, than domestic politics, but some of the rules still apply. Just because an individual says something doesn't necessarily mean that individual wants it. Just because a country asserts a certain position of that government or that population doesn't necessarily mean that that is what that government actually and really thinks. Take, for example, Joe Biden saying he's pushing $15 an hour minimum wage. Is he for it? Maybe, maybe not. Are the people who are putting money in his pocket for it? Absolutely not. However, if Joe Biden wants to get elected, he needs to carry popular support. The popular support is for it, so he's going to push and advocate for that particular policy when he gets in office. Oh, we just couldn't get it done. Golly gee. Same thing with the PRO Act. The unions, a backbone of America. But is he really going to put the item through to denote and get across that very specific point that they are indeed the backbone of America? The U.S., up to, let's say, Trump asserting this notion that the Jerusalem should take the embassy. Well, most presidents will say it. Most presidents didn't do it. They wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole because they don't want to deal with the implications of it. People take positions all the time that they don't necessarily believe, knowing that they will be stopped from fulfilling what the position actually means or the logical outcome of the position. They're blocked in some way. They were stopped in some way from doing it, even though really they didn't entirely believe it. Something like this is happening with Russia. And if you want another example, Israel and let's say Arab states. So you would get these states like Saudi Arabia that are working in tandem and coordination with Israel, and for the most part even agrees with Israel on a lot of stuff, but have a difficult time coming out and showing that allegiance. Even the other Gulf states showing that allegiance because their populations are dramatically against, let's say, the higher ups, the people who are part of the established crown of it all. Well, they have a vested interest in working with Israel on all sorts of issues, especially issues that are economic, whereas the population itself are not going to benefit from that. The population for itself have some feelings about what Israel is doing in that open-air ghetto to Palestine, and that the openness by which the elites in their society deal with that country, well, it's sketchy and dubious at best. Russia did this with one of its allies, Iran. And the reason it does it makes all the sense in the world. And it is a fascinating story by the New York Times. I would argue that this is probably the part of it that's most interesting. Meaning, there's a leaked conversation with foreign ministers of Zarif. And the leaked conversation, he's basically saying, look, I don't have as much power and agency as I wanted. Well, no shit, Sherlock. Of course that's going to be true. That's like John Kerry saying, I don't have as much power as I would want. Okay. Or that's like Blinken. I don't have much power as I want. Basically, the point that I'm trying to get at is the person in the State Department will be subordinate to militaristic concerns, and it will be subordinate to the power structure concerns. So if the president, or let's say the Ayatollah, had a command, then yes, Zarif, the foreign minister, is going to be stuck with that. He's not going to have agency and power beyond that command. If Soleimani, for somebody who's in the military, has a command that they believe is militaristically necessary, then again, the State Department or the foreign ministry is going to be subordinate to those commands. Having this leak is not really telling you anything that you don't necessarily intuitively know about Zarif's position. Even though the press plays that part up. He's a part of a government. He's not the government. He's not even the strongest component of that government. Just like the State Department or the foreign ministry of other governments wouldn't be the strongest component of that government. It's very bizarre that they seem to think that. On top of that, Iran is in a permanent militaristic position. They're under attack by Israel. They're under attack by the United States, and the patsy nations of the U.S. and the Gulf countries could very well take advantage. So from their standpoint, they are in perpetual military attack. They are under attack from sanctions, which are an act of war. And the pressure strategy that the U.S. was using, they were trying to undermine and topple that government. And if Syria had fell, Iran would have most likely have been next. So from their standpoint, yes, the military is going to get the lay of the land. They're going to get to say in this. We would be no different. If we were under attack by the Brits and this was 18 something, the foreign ministry would be deprioritized in favor of militaristic concerns and needs. And even the president himself, even though it would be civilian control, he would probably be taking a certain degree, a heavy degree of emphasis from militaristic concerns. I'm not quite sure why anyone believed Iran would be different. No, the interesting part here has to do with the JCPOA. Now, there were several signatories to the JCPOA. Russia was one of them. Now, if you are, let's say, Russia for the moment, and the United States, being overly aggressive in the way that it has attacked other countries, well, it's done something. It alienates various other actors. So it doesn't like Iran, so it passes sanctions and attacks Iran. It doesn't like North Korea, so it passes sanctions and attacks North Korea. It doesn't like Syria, so it tries to undermine the government and create a war. It doesn't like Venezuela. It doesn't like, let's say, Ecuador, if Ecuador gets a left-wing government. It doesn't necessarily like Bolivia or Honduras if they get left-wing governments. They like the Honduras guy who gives all the cocaine in the world, trying to get up and ring those noses. But the point I'm getting at is you're bifurcating the world. You're creating some countries that you like and some countries that you don't like. And the countries that you don't like are entirely, in most cases, just because they don't follow your line and they're not vassal states. So if you have China that the U.S. has been castigating, you have Russia that the U.S. has been castigating, you have Iran that the U.S. has been castigating, what does that look like? It looks like a power block. That looks like a power block. Russia, China, Iran, Syria, North Korea, Venezuela, and the other countries that may want to get involved in that. Yes, that looks like a power block in the same neighborhood. But what happens when those countries that are pushed together by U.S. interests, pushed together because of U.S. foreign policy and U.S. boisterousness and muscularity, what happens if Iran ceases to be at odds with the U.S. in overt terms? What happens? Now, we know that vassal states of the United States often take on the same tact and interests as the U.S. government. So if the United States doesn't like somebody, well, Australia is probably not going to like them. The UK is not going to like them. Germany is not going to like them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the influence of the U.S. So Germany has Nord Stream 2 getting gas from Russia. Oh, well, the U.S. doesn't like the United States. So pressure is applied to Germany about Nord Stream 2 and various people who are in the German government to try to crush and get rid of that platform, that policy, that project, even though it is a German's explicit interest to go through with that project. Same thing is true for China and Huawei. So you would have pressure put on the UK to say, hey, don't use that product, despite the fact that the product is in their best interest. You would have pressure put on Brazil to say, hey, don't use Sputnik V, despite the fact that that vaccine is in their best interest. Or Panama, hey, don't use Cuban doctors, despite the fact that Cuban doctors are all over the place and it's in their best interest. You get pressure applied to try to stop you from using those particular products or those services that are on the naughty list of the U.S. government. What if Iran became one of those states, not even entirely a vassal state, but definitely state enough where the sanctions are compelling their behavior? And by saying, hey, we need you to not do that with Russia. We need you to not assist with that with China. We need you to not assist with that with Venezuela or whatever it is. But we need you to not do that. And we will keep this relationship blooming between us. What if relations between Iran and the U.S. normalized on some level? And within the context of that normalization, Iran would be willing, moderate government, to do things in private, just like you might have some of those Arab countries working with Israel at a top level, but not necessarily having the rhetoric that goes with that action. But what if it's willing to do that and create relationships that are somewhat, in some way, antagonistic to China and to Russia, and maybe some other countries in that bloc? Well, if you were Russia, wouldn't you be concerned with that? Just, if you were human beings and you had a friend and you were in a circle like that, you would be concerned that that friend was going to start fucking you over and looking at you in a particular way to be friends with the other friends. No different in a geopolitical sense. These are relationships of sorts. And in this very specific context, Russia did not want Iran to start moving into the orbit of the West. So from the standpoint of the JCPOA being a document that would allow a basis of interaction and engagement and understanding with one another, where the sanctions can be removed and relations can be changed, Russia was against it. I didn't know that. I didn't even think about that. But this is one of those things you got to put yourself in the heads of other countries. Russia wasn't against it because they didn't think that the policy wouldn't work. Or they weren't against it because they thought that, okay, this is a horrible, horrible deal for Iran. On some level, it was a bad deal for Iran. No, they were against it for their own geopolitical interests. They weren't even against it from the standpoint of war and peace. They were against it from the standpoint of, it is not in our interests if Iran gets closer to the United States. We don't think there's going to be a war. And because we don't think there's going to be a war, this deal, even though it brings down a certain degree of hysteria that's around the globe, it makes our situation, on some level, worse. Meaning, American bellicosity makes their situation better. Isn't that fascinating? Like basically, Donald Trump's policy, Obama's policy on some level, but Donald Trump's policy, the pressure strategy that he was using, getting out of the JCPOA and everything else, that has basically worked in the interests of Russia and has worked in the interests of creating this world bifurcation. Because Russia's concern was that the JCPOA was going to normalize relations. Well, Donald Trump has killed and destroyed the JCPOA. Not just that, the bellicosity has basically created a space more so for hardliners in Iran to come to power as a result of the United States' actions. And because of the sanctions, Joe Biden haven't just left the sanctions and went back to, they didn't do all that. So Russia's concern about the JCPOA ended up being unfounded only because Trump utterly destroyed the JCPOA in and of itself. But it's U.S. provocativeness or provocative action that pushes these countries together in order to work in their common and shared interests. And so the bloc of China, Russia, Venezuela, etc., Iran, Syria, except it's being established based on our provocative actions around the globe and the sanctions regime to which we create. And yeah, bellicosity and attacking one country after the next, making those countries feel, and in real terms, especially based on from the standpoint of coups, unsafe. I think that's a fascinating aspect of this. Despite what Russia wanted, the deal went through. And look, I was one of those people that was for the deal because I didn't necessarily want the hysteria to stay. And from Russia's standpoint, it's not so much a war and peace issue, I don't think. It seemed to be an issue of more so of what orbit Iran stayed into. Can we keep them here? Are they going to go there? And the JCPOA being a framework to which relations can be articulated. So now you have a JCPOA that is tenuous. And you have a U.S. that is out of it, radically so. And in order to mend the gap at all, the U.S. would have to basically abandon sanctions, which politically is something that Joe Biden has henceforth refused to do. Now, it's not that he refused to do it because he thought getting out of it was the wrong choice. He clearly thought getting out of it was the wrong choice. It's an issue of saving face. If the United States says, okay, we're going to get rid of the sanctions, then the U.S. will admit that basically that it was wrong to get out of it. Well, the news media doesn't have a context for that. The news media can only ask, hey, what are you going to do with Iran on the negotiations? Well, we're going to bring Iran back into compliance. Nobody raises their hands and says, what do you mean Iran back into compliance? The U.S. put sanctions on Iran. Every sanction, or every day there's a sanction, is another day that the U.S. is out of compliance. When is the U.S. going to come into compliance? They don't ask that. That doesn't process in their heads. It doesn't occur to them. The idea that Trump pulled out of the deal is either a vague memory for them, or at the very least something they don't bring up. So Psaki could talk about it in the weird way that she talks about it. And everybody's okay with it. And then they're shocked to shit that no deal could be found. How could a deal be found when your press can't even express what actually and honestly happened? And so if Zarif making this point about the difficulties of this, yeah. I don't even know who leaked this. I'm curious about who leaked this, though. For all I know, Zarif could have leaked it himself. I have no idea who leaked this. I'm curious about seeing who benefits or who loses within the context of this being out. But like I said, some of this is a no shit Sherlock about the power, diminutive level of power in comparison to, let's say, the governmental structure, the Ayatollah, or for that matter, the military. No. The interesting part here is Russia not wanting them to be a part of it. And just so you see what I'm looking at. Yes. In a recording of a conversation on March between Zarif and an economist named Saeed Lesla, an ally was not meant for publication. Foreign minister can be repeatedly heard saying on the audio. A copy of the leak sent to the Persian news channel Iran International, which first reported on the recording and shared it with the New York Times. Mr. Zarif confirms that they've long suspected, he did not dispute the authenticity of a question why. Right here. But some of Soleimani's actions also damaged the country, citing as an example his moves against the JCPOA. Mr. Zarif said Russia did not want the agreement to succeed and, quote, put all of its weight behind creating obstacles because it was not in Moscow's interest to normalize relations with the West. To that end, Zarif said, General Soleimani traveled to Russia to demolish our achievements, meaning the nuclear deal. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing? Basically, Soleimani didn't agree with the deal. And he traveled to Russia to try to get Russia to help basically kill the deal. Russia was also putting obstacles in because it didn't necessarily suit Russian interests. That is astonishing. Nevertheless, the deal went through either way. The deal went through regardless. And the concerns of Russia at that point didn't get a chance to be unfounded because of the bellicosity of Trump, which basically destroyed the relationship that could have been fostered between Iran and the United States. And honestly, whether it was Trump or whether it was somebody else, I have a hard time believing that relationship would have been cordial, or if Russia's plans would have been, or fears would have been founded, at least not originated or not anytime soon. But it didn't even get the chance to. Pulling out of it basically killed that deal and that opportunity. The world did get the chance to bifurcate on some level with China, Russia, Iran, Syria, Venezuela, working in tandem. And by the way, China, Russia, and Iran working in specific literal tandem with one another at this point. The sanctions, the attacks, the going after the various countries, the bellicosity. We've united the world against us. That is not a positive thing. But the New York Times piece here is fascinating. That leak from Zarif is fascinating. What's also fascinating is who leaked it. Is this going to have a play in the elections that are taking place? Are the hardliners going to be the ones that come in because of the damage that was done to this? And if the hardliners are the ones that are going to come in, they're going to be the ones that are most interested in not staying with the JCPOA. The Ayatollah has already said, don't waste your time in these long negotiations with the United States. They can't be trusted. Who would want that deal to be crushed? Israel wants the deal to be crushed. Has Israel been running foreign policy escapades in Iran? Yes, including potential assassinations. That answer is yes. Is it possible for Israel to get their hands on communications for Zarif like this? Yes. And would they leak that if that meant stopping the JCPOA because of the relationship, when Zarif comes out with it, talking about the deal and everything else? If they believe that something like this would somehow, for one particular reason or another, interfere with the JCPOA or put hardliners in power in Iran, would they do it? Yes. In the same way that it wasn't about world peace from Russia's interests. Because again, Russia's looking at this as who's the orbit. What is an articulation of association? And would the JCPOA do that? Even if it's a small chance for it. Would that chance be there? Yes. So Russia is against it. It's against Russian interests, despite the fact that it helps with the world temperature. World peace didn't matter. It is against our interests politically, geopolitically, strategically. Hope you realize that. That's important. It's not about peace. Israel looks at this. It's not about peace. This is about what is in Israel's interests. the JCPOA from Israel's standpoint? It's not in our interest. How do we stop the JCPOA from coming to existence? What happens if Foreign Minister Zarif's communications get leaked? And would that leak in any way damage that government? And will we do it if it did? And if another government that came in was a hardliners and they weren't going to go for the deal, does that suit Israel's interests? Yes. The question is, does the leak damage Zarif or that government in any particular way that undermines that government's ability to get reelected? That's the question. Now, I think who benefits from that leak is clearly the question. And the question is how and who benefits. I'm curious about how this plays politically. I'm curious about, I think that the JCPOA and the sanctions that the U.S. are keeping on is damaging the ability for the JCPOA to come into existence. That said, Israel knows that the U.S. wants the JCPOA back on. The U.S. just doesn't have a way to save face. So what is Israel going to do to stop that deal from coming back into force, especially if it doesn't have the ear of the United States on this front? Like, this is, these are the questions that are coming up that are taking place from an international standpoint. But these are the players. And so if the U.S. wants to get back to the deal, they get rid of the sanctions. Joe Biden doesn't seem to be able to or willing to do that. Iran, for his point, has been ramping up enrichment. And in part to show how weak you are in getting us to do anything at this point. And no, we don't trust you anymore. You broke the deal. And not just broke the deal, your sanctions have been killing people here in this country. So you can understand this is getting far more tense in regard to political space. From Russia's standpoint, this firmly entrenches Iran in their orbit. Game, set, match. Trump's behavior and the U.S.'s current behavior, calling genocide and all this other stuff, has firmly entrenched China, Russia, Iran, Syria in one specific orbit. How many countries in Africa would be a part of that? Venezuela is beginning a wall from Iran. That means they're in their orbit. The South American countries also that have experienced sanctions and attacks from the United States, including coups, whose orbit do you think they will be in the coming decade? We have not been a good benefactor of our position and station. And honestly, any person, any group that is in the context of a world that is trying to win and dominate, it's not about specifics and overt domination of one particular thing or everything at once. There's a such thing as power and articulation of that power around the globe. And we've jumped the shark. We've jumped the shark in a way that we've pushed people, groups, countries that we believe that were subordinate in some particular way away through attacks. Missing the fact that the world is not something that you could just win as an outright thing. It is something that changes and shifts, and you have to go along with the geopolitical shifts in the way that you articulate power and work and smooth, soft power. But somehow, along the way, we've lost that. And we've gotten to this mindset that we're not going to negotiate or work with a win-win. We're just going to dictate. And in the context of that dictates, pushed countries away. And those countries that were pushed away, that may individually be weak, individually have a difficult time dealing with the U.S. and its economic clout, cobbled together because it's a rational thing to do. And in the context of cobbling together, subordinated some of the main concerns or issues that they may have had with one another, and they set their focus on, okay, how can we work together militaristically, economically, politically, in order to settle and keep ourselves safe, secure, and prosperous into the coming century? And other countries that were attacked say, hey, we like that. And they cobble together also. And they go. Western states, the patsy nations of Europe, they look at this and they don't know what to do with this. They want to be able to negotiate with those other countries. They also want to negotiate with the United States, but they don't particularly like the vassal state status and whatnot. By the same token, they're there nonetheless. The levels of cooperation that they can try to do with those countries that will be advancing and will be prospering also, on some level, is going to be curtailed by the interaction with the United States. Look at Huawei and the way within the UK or the natural gas thing. I'm just making the point that we've jumped the shark in the way that we've articulated and used that kind of unipolar power thing for that period of time that we had it. And those countries have started to work in coordination with one another. And we, being the thing that they've started to work in coordination against, but the primary here is us pushing them. We have basically, from Russia's standpoint, took the best possible opportunity or the best possible course of action and shot ourselves in the foot. Yeah, I don't know. That part of that is fascinating. I'd love to get people on to talk about, hey, what is the point of view of the other country when they're into this? And Russia's point of view. Everybody has those doubts and fears. Are they going to screw us over if they start to get closer to the West? And this case, the West didn't even allow them the opportunity to do so. So right now, we have created blocks of countries against us. And honestly, Russia, China, Iran, Syria, that block is going to be potent. I understand that Syria and the conditions it's in. I even get in the conditions that Iran are in right now. But having a certain degree of militaristic cooperation where those countries can grow and prosper, they will grow and prosper. And the catch becomes, what does that look like into the coming decade? China is trying to do its Belt and Road Initiative. The U.S. has been trying to stop it. It's been unsuccessful on that front. And look, this is not, I keep making a point before, like the Soviet Union, where you have a country that is somewhat of an economic basket case. China has found a model that works. And it's been found cooperation around the globe, including Africa being one of those big players. The Russia, still technologically, militaristically, and even from a scientific standpoint, very intact, very advanced. No, you have a different world. And we have not been good stewards of this in the way that we've played this. And we've undermined ourselves in trying to be overly muscular. I'm going to end this here. I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, and I'm going to say subscribe.